Namaste. Last time we read about collected works of Sri Aurobindo, volume 13, Essays in Philosophy and Yoga as part 1. So it contains series of 5 separate sections, and 4 are written before 1920-21, and one has been written in 1949-50, so it has a great different kind of an significance. But out of this 5 sections, there are at least 3 books which can be taken out. One of them, Yoga and Its Objects, which was already published in 1921 as a book. In 1922, the title was changed to The Yoga and Its Object, not Objects. Then it was reprinted about 4 or 5 times, the importance of this book. However, Sri Aurobindo in 1934 made it clear that this represents an early stage of sadhana, and it does not apply fully as the yoga evolved. And that is very evident in 1912. If you read through this book, largely you will see it is the yoga of the Gita developed into the larger lines of the integral yoga. It's very evident. Fundamentals, we see that they are quite similar, like samarpan, equanimity, all these are there, complete faith. So these are fundamental elements which are common to integral yoga and the yoga of the Gita. But what you won't see in yoga and its object is the supermind, supramental. You won't see about the transformation. You won't have the word psychic being. There will be soul. Because the word psychic being came later. In fact, it is the mother who introduced this word. And obviously you don't have the mother. You have the divine Shakti. But having said that, it lays down a very broad, wonderful foundation as we read last time. And if we see in Synthesis of Yoga, one of the crucial chapters is the 4 aids. And in Yoga and Its Object, there is a whole page which speaks about these 4 aids. So that way it's a wonderful book, and I would say it's a must read. Not because one can completely follow the yoga reading it, but at least it gives us a very good view of what the yoga is about, its object, and that purpose is beautifully served. And the second book that comes out of it, which we didn't speak about, is The Problem of Rebirth. So it's roughly runs into 200 pages of marvelous writing, nowhere else in Sri Aurobindo's writings. Which includes the Life Divine, where he talks about rebirth. It includes Letters on Yoga, where he talks about rebirth. Nowhere we'll find this kind of a connectedness of every aspect of rebirth. For instance, Sri Aurobindo takes up rebirth and karma. This is the common thing. So karma, law of karma. What really is law of karma? Is it punitive? Is it justice? Is it a mechanical, mathematical accountancy? Is it something else? Is it learning by consequences? All these aspects, traditional law of karma, the critic of the traditional law, the popular idea of the law of karma, what it represents in depths, and all that we find here, the significance of rebirth and heredity. Nobody has ever touched upon it. How come, does the soul choose a heredity? Is it a chance? Is it an accident? All these things. And then, of course, the significance of rebirth, karma and freedom, karma, will and consequence. Is our will really free? And if it is not really free, to what extent are the consequences of karma justified? If my will is moving within a small and narrow limits, so to what extent consequences in terms of punishment really are justified? Then karma and justice, somebody did bad to me, must suffer, vengeance. And is karmic law a means for vengeance? And when we speak about doing good work, good karma and bad karma, what is good karma? Is it morally good or something else that is meant? So all these questions he takes up in great detail, and I'll just read 2 passages. It's in Collected Works of Sri Aurobindo, volume 13, but this December issue was on this ground only. The Law of Karma, December 2021 issue of All India Magazine. So here Sri Aurobindo speaks about karma and justice, which is the common ground for karma. If you have done something, you are going to get its consequence in lives to come. So here Sri Aurobindo explains it very beautifully. The idea is that there must be a justice governing the award of happiness and misery on the earth, a humanly intelligible equity, and that the law of karma represents it and gives us its formula. That's how it is understood. Because we can't explain the anomaly. Why is it that a wicked man seemingly prospers? Why is it that a good man seemingly suffers? So, to fill this gap in our understanding of the spiritual metaphysics, so we have put it as rebirth, reward, punishment. But we have missed the real secret of rebirth. I have done so much evil, that too must come back to me in so much exact and accurate punishment and misfortune. There must be so much outward suffering or an inward suffering caused by outward event and pressure. For if there were not this physically sensible, visible, inevitable result, where would be any avenging justice and where could we find any deterrent sanction in nature against evil? Question mark. These are not Sri Aurobindo's views, but he's saying this is how the tradition understands it. And this award is that of an exact judge, a precise administrator, a scrupulous merchant of good for good and evil for evil, evil for evil, who has learned nothing and will never learn anything of the Christian or Buddhistic ideal rule, has no bowels of mercy or compassion. Look at the humor. No forgiveness for sin. He's a just accountant. He is not interested. It's almost like death. A terrible judge. You go and plead mercy. Even on earth we have clemency and president can pardon. But here is an accountant who notes and gives, but holds austerely to an eternal Mosaic law, the law of Moses. Eye for eye, tooth for tooth, a full, slow, or swift, but always calm and precisely merciless lex talionis. So, by the very, Sri Aurobindo has this wonderful, among many other things, he conveys a thing with such power and precision through a strange, a wry sense of humor. That this is what you want to believe in? You believe God is this with no better business, but he is making us reflect that is it really true? We are basically painting a merciless God. This commercial and mathematical accountant is sometimes supposed to act with a startling precision. A curious story was published the other day, figuring as a fact of contemporary occurrence, of a rich man who had violently deprived another of his substance. The victim is born as the son of the oppressor, and in the delirium of a fatal illness reveals that he has obliged his old tyrant and present father to spend on him, and so lose the monetary equivalent of the property robbed minus a certain sum, but that sum must be paid now, otherwise the debt is absolved, and as the last piece is expended, the reborn soul departs. For its sole object in taking birth is satisfied, account squared, and the spirit of karma content. The narrower the mind, the more these kind of belief systems. And I have read this kind of explanations given in, I don't want to name systems. Even somebody asked me a question, sir, is it true I hear Mr. X or Miss X giving a lecture that, karma is a precise mathematical thing. So here is an answer to that Sri Aurobindo is giving. That is the mechanical idea of karma at its acme of satisfied precision. Now you look at Sri Aurobindo's language. At the same time, the popular mind, in its attempt to combine the idea of a life beyond with the notion of rebirth, supposes a double price for virtue and a double penalty for transgression. We had never thought like that, isn't it? Jaaki narak mein sadoge. You will rot in hell. After that, when you come back, that's not the end. You have to come back here also and pay the price. So what is happening is double penalty. Which legal system does it? Not even a human legal system. Double reward. First you will go to heaven. Why? Because you are a good guy here. And when you come back, you are going to again enjoy being born with a silver spoon in the mouth. Why? Because you were a good guy. And Sri Aurobindo several places with scathing humor. At one place he goes on to say, in that case, you can't even explain why there are radical conversions. For instance, a wicked man is apparently, good in this life. Why so? And a good man, when you see him suffering upon earth and you say that he was evil in the previous life, therefore he is suffering. But then the beauty is that he was evil in previous life and he is, suffering though a good man. What changed him from that wicked person to suddenly a saintly person in this life? So these are, and there are many other gaps, but paucity of time, we are not touching upon it. Some other time we'll take up. And then he says, is it really the reason why we should be good? That we should be good because we'll be born with a silver spoon? Is it really behoves a developed soul of humanity? Then he says, what is true ethics? The strands of a nature which mix in this natural but hardly philosophical conception have to be disentangled before we can disengage the right value of these ideas. Their first motive seems to be ethical, for justice is an ethical notion, but true ethics is dharma. The right fulfillment and working of the higher nature and right action should have right motive, should be its own justification and not go limping on the crutches of greed and fear. So if you are doing right, should it be because I have greed or next life I'll have a reward? And if should it be because I am afraid of a punishment, therefore I shouldn't do it? So what will happen is there'll be hypocrisy. This is what happens. But this is not the basis of the law of karma. And Sri Aurobindo goes on. But in natural man, born before the higher dharma and more potent and normal as a motive to action, come two other very insistent things. Kama, earth, desire and pleasure of enjoyment, with its corresponding fear of suffering and interest of possession, acquisition. Success, with its complementary pain of lacking and frustration. And this is what governs most prominently the normal, barbaric, or still half barbaric natural man. So it is a barbaric law which a barbaric man supposed. So what is it? He says, he needs to some not small extent, if he is to conform his close pursuit of desire and interest to the ethical standard, a strict association or identity of result of virtue with some getting of his interest and pleasure, and result of sin with some loss of materially or vitally desirable things, and the infliction of mental, vital, or physical pain. So people would say, but no, but there have been great beings who told this. Yes, because great beings were not great psychologists, they were not great, they didn't go into all the things, they just realized some aspect of the divine. But there were many other things, people asked them question. But how to answer it? They were not like that master who was asked about death. So the master said, I can't say about it. But you know everything. He says, yes, but I am a living master, not a dead one. How can I answer about death? But Sri Aurobindo, while living, has gone beyond into the realms of death. And he has seen karma as so many examples of in Sri Aurobindo's life, whereas he has seen the strange association of karma. And when you look at it, some of the radical, interesting conversions in Sri Aurobindo ashram among his disciples were both Aurangzeb and Dara Shikoh. How come after so many, Aurangzeb had one good quality in him that brought him here. He was fanatic to the hilt, but in his zealot for love of God, he really believed that you must follow it 1, 2, 3, 4. But he was a tyrant when it came to the way he massacred. Now he thought he is doing something good. He was doing according to the tenets of whatever his religion taught him. On the other hand, Dara Shikoh was a different kind of a person. He was interested in Upanishads and the Indian thought. Aurangzeb killed Dara Shikoh. Now, but the interesting part is that they both came here. Now, what happened to their life? Well, Dara stayed here. Aurangzeb went away from here. Died a miserable death. Not Aurangzeb, sorry, but reincarnated. So the law of karma, to just summarize it, because it's a huge subject, is essentially evolutionary. If the original purpose of creation is to manifest the divine, the law of karma and everything else in it will proceed from that basis and lead us towards that. The law of karma is basically a constant growth through learning, a constant evolution through various consequences that we go through, and these consequences are much more inner than outer. It's not about being born in a rich family, maybe even a punishment. Because you are too much into comfort and you don't seek the higher. Being born in a poor family, meeting challenges or meeting several challenges like Pandava may open up inside within us and deep evolutionary urge. So its consequences are primarily inner. When we do something which is evil, we shut the doors of the delight within us. And when we do something which is generous, beautiful, good not because we want a reward, but because naturally we radiate that goodness, then we open up to vastness and there is joy within our being. This is the law of karma. Then we move on to the third book, which is what we thought we'll take up. And this is, though it is incomplete, but because till 1950, Sri Aurobindo wrote about 8 essays. These are his last essays, last piece of writings, and therefore are a must read. As we know, after 1921, Sri Aurobindo primarily, yes, of course, The Mother, but that is a book. Savitri and poems is a different thing altogether. But otherwise, Sri Aurobindo did not write prose writings. He just wrote letters, which are plenty and marvelous and beautiful. We'll come to that later on. But the only series of articles he wrote, he didn't write at the behest of, Tagore, and when Radhakrishnan asked him, everybody he turned down. And obviously he couldn't turn down the mother. And the occasion was very interesting because the school had started. And people were asked to go to the playground. Children need physical exercise. Some of the grown-up members said, can we join? Yes, of course you join. Initially they felt it's a bodybuilding, we will stay fit. But slowly the mother started reminding them that anything that she has done is not just for the usual outer reasons that we imagine it to be. So there were 2 groups in the ashram during that time. Of course, there are some people who don't care or they are too involved with service. They didn't, whether they go to playground, don't go to playground, it didn't matter. People like Amrita and, Champak Lalji. But there was a group which said, wonderful, we must do exercise and stay fit. And there was the other groups who said, why is there a playground and sports in ashram? We are supposed to do meditation. So there was this group which believed that ashram is taking a different turn which is not consistent with true spiritual life. So the mother approached Sri Aurobindo. If you write, they will understand these boys. This is the background. So there was this journal which still comes, the bulletin of this, Sri Aurobindo International Center of Education, the physical education department. So in that, Sri Aurobindo wrote a series of articles. The mother, in that series, there was published what is now Notes on the Way, where all her experiences with the body were published. That's how it started. And the first one was a message that Sri Aurobindo gave to this journal. And in this message itself, he makes it very clear that why it is necessary. One is, this of course is the second essay, but Sharir Madhyam Khalu Dharma Sadhanam, body is the basis of everything. Even if you want to sit for meditation, that's why in Patanjali Yoga Sutra you talk about asana and other things. So instead of doing it individually, she organized it so that everybody can attend to it. And if body is weak, we'll end up with the same old story of, spirit is willing but the flesh is weak, and slowly take the body as an obstacle and leave it untouched. But Sri Aurobindo reminded that the body is part of the integral yoga. We have to include it in not only in the process but also in the eventual fulfillment. So here he wrote about the body's destiny, what is its future, what are the challenges. So in the first message he writes, but of a higher import than the foundation, however necessary, of health, strength and fitness of the body. This is a basic thing required. How can one even sit and meditate if the body is unfit? So this is the minimum, strength, fitness. But he says, higher than that is the development of discipline and morale and sound and strong character, towards which these activities can help. Because it was not just asanas. In fact, the mother said that, from our experience we have found it's not one set of exercises that you can call as yogic. You have to do them with a yogic attitude. So he started games, wrestling, competitions. People were completely at loss. What's happening? So he explains. There are many sports Like for instance, he said tennis is very interesting. He said tennis is a spiritual game. And if you go back to the origin of tennis, table tennis, and before that ping pong. Ping pong was a spiritual game played by the lamas. And it was a game by which you could not only achieve other things but intensely concentrate and keep the compassion. See, normally in a game you get into the flow of the vital and you get into success. I must win. Now, how did the lamas play ping pong? The ping, the person, throws the ball into the other person. The other person is supposed to bow down, take the ball, and be accurate. Then again, this person bows down and takes the ball. Just imagine what concentration. Constantly, you have to have the compassion that you are playing not to win, but the oneness should not be forgotten. So, from ping pong, all these two games have come. The mother, like everything, went into a fast track. She made it into a spiritual game, which was lawn tennis. Even table tennis, the mother liked. And then the lawn tennis. Why? Because that ping pong, that was okay for a very bit of sedentary life. This is a game where you need strength, everything, but at the same time, the principle was the same. So, there are many sports which are of utmost value toward this end because they help to form and even necessitate the qualities of courage, hardihood, energetic action, and initiative, or call for skill, steadiness of will, or rapid decision and action. The perception of what is to be done in an emergency and dexterity in doing it. All these qualities develop through sports. And that's why no wonder in schools where there is all the time all about memory and all this. What happens to children? They lack some of these fundamental qualities. They ultimately graduate and postgraduate, but they don't build character because character is never built by giving moral science lessons. Everybody gets thoroughly bored in moral science classes. And even if you learn it because you have to get marks, as we did in the convent school, you don't follow it because it's not natural and organic to you. It's something very arbitrary, black and white. But in sports, it develops. One of the things so needed in yogic life, perseverance, equanimity, you develop in sports. Today I've lost, doesn't matter. What happens to the teams? After that, they shake hands, they go together, sit together. You are lamenting, oh, India har gaya, India har gaya. The Indian team and the Pakistani team, after all that, initially, then they go back and they say, come, let's have. I don't want to say what they will have. But idea is that, it's after all a game. And tomorrow we'll have another game which will play better. So that's how it develops what is called as the sportsman spirit. And another development, he says, one development of the utmost value is the awakening of the essential and instinctive body consciousness which can see and do what is necessary without any indication from mental thought and which is equivalent in the body to swift insight in the mind and spontaneous and rapid decision in the will. One example of this body consciousness. When we come out of the ashram or temple or wherever we open the slippers, isn't it? And now, of course, everybody keeps the slipper at the right place. But normally, if there is a big you may have something similar, but you go and you put your feet in the slipper and you walk. Now, this because the body consciousness, you don't give a mental thought, this make, that make, you don't. Recently, only first time I noticed that what really are the slippers that I am wearing. Because I wanted oh my God, I need to identify because there is something similar. You don't know. Similarly with your scooter, with many things, the body consciousness does it habitually, mechanically, but it is basically, there's like a swift insight. It's an ultra rapid functioning in the body. And if the body consciousness develops, it can instinctively repel many things. Like animals, you try to turn them into alcoholics, they won't. But in man, these body instincts are corrupted by the mind and the vital. Oh, it's cool to drink. Okay, fine. If you drink, you are regarded as a high society. Fine. So it corrupts the bodily instinct. Otherwise, what is the body's first reaction to smoke and drink? Cough and vomit. That's how it is. So this is how we corrupt the body instinct. Now, this develops the body instincts, which is so necessary. Because when it is developed, then the next level it can go, wherein it can become an instrument. So this body instinct, which is already there, it is developed. Body instinct is developed. We know how much to eat. All this is corrupted. Like, I know about my own file, how much it gets corrupted over a period of time because of beta ye khale, eat this, eat that. Indian homes, loving mothers. By the time you are grown up, then somebody says have organic. That is another kind of food fad. So it's corrupted. The original instinct is corrupted. Children don't need all that. So one may add the formation of a capacity for harmonious and right movements of the body, especially in a combined action, economical of physical effort and discouraging waste of energy, which result from such exercises as marches or drill, and which displays the loose and straggling, the inharmonious or disorderly or wasteful movements common to the untrained individual body. There was some classic examples within the ashram context. One was our Dilip Kumar Roy. When he would march, the left hand is going elsewhere, the right is elsewhere. Even we have somebody now. So I asked him, "Aap jate nahi hai for marching?" He said, "What to do? I can never," because he is so intellectually developed person. But he says that, I just cannot. There is no coordination in the different parts of the body. But body has to be included in the yoga. The integral yoga fulfillment is there. Even for the practice of the yoga, if the body cannot remain still, cannot remain in a state of coordination. So he reminds us, why do we have the marching and drill? People come, they don't realize. They think that, this is marching and drill. Oh, they are following some RSS. Somebody asked me, is the ashram affiliated to RSS? Why? Because they do this. So, and the marching and drill. I said, well, you have just reversed the whole thing. What? I said, RSS and many other things are affiliated to the vision of a united India to that extent. Dr. Munje and many of these people did come and meet Sri Aurobindo. They understood at least that there should be collective discipline in all this. But not that it is following something. Because if it was strictly that, then they would not have women wearing khaki half pant and T-shirts, and that is never, Now, thankfully, they have started, I think, a ladies' wing, but it was not there. So, all these things are there. You learn to accept, you see. You accept that, yes, women can be dressed. You see how mother's one action was curing us of many things. Oh, she's a girl. Oh, I'm a boy. Oh, he's a boy. I'm a girl. This is how it starts. All the nature's play starts. Here you don't know whether it's a girl or a boy. And you may receive a good punch from a girl if you try to. There have been such instances. And that's because people develop this. See, we have not grown up like that. So we had this difficulty. But for those who grow up, it is true that to an extent, they just get over this boy-girl feeling so soon. For us, we have to try it and then, because they grow up so spontaneously. So it has many actions simultaneously. And then he says, sporting spirit that includes good humor and tolerance and consideration for all. Honesty to an extent where you are out. When those days when there was no third empire, I mean, at least I know, Gavaskar, one thing great about the man. He would just walk away. He wouldn't wait for the empire's decision. Even if there is a doubt, a debate, he would just walk away. There have been cricketers like that. Why? Because they know it's not about winning or losing, but doing the thing which is the right thing to do. All this comes just by playing, not just cricket, many other. Her good humor, a right attitude and friendliness to competitors and rivals, self-control and scrupulous observations of the laws of the game, fair play and avoidance of the use of foul means, an equal acceptance of victory or defeat without bad humor, resentment or ill will towards successful competitors, loyal acceptance of the decisions of the appointed judge, umpire, or referee. These qualities have their value for life in general and not only for sport, but the help that sport can give to their development is direct and invaluable. It's very unfortunate that it has been corrupted thanks to the big money. So now, though to an extent it's good that now we have different nationalities coming together. That's a good part. but at the same time, big money and fast pace. So sometimes there are at least people who start, using a foul language. They are caught in that heat of the moment. But still, the sports develop it. More important still is the custom of discipline. So, all these things he reminds us, innumerable are the activities in life, especially in national life, in which leadership and obedience to leadership in combined action are necessary for success, victory, and combat or fulfillment of a purpose. So, the role of the leader, the captain, the power and skill of his leadership, and to what extent the mother went on. She says, if some problem took place within a group, she called the captain. She said, you were not in the right attitude. To that extent, she held the leader and the captain, the class teacher, responsible for the group that was operating with him. And finally, he says, there could be no success for an orchestra in which individual musicians played according to their own fancy. So, collective plays, collective yoga, you must have some kind of a discipline. Otherwise, what happens? What is happening today in, for instance, Auroville? There are groups, each with its own law. But here is reminding us that if you don't have the spirit that this is an orchestra and everybody going by his own fancy, I am a law unto myself. So anarchy may be the last stage of development, Sri Aurobindo says in Thoughts and Aphorism, but done prematurely, it will lead us straight into the trap of the devil. So ultimate anarchy, yes, but it's a divine anarchy where each one discovers. In spiritual things also the same rule holds. A sadhak who disregarded the guidance of the guru and preferred the untrained inspirations of the novice could hardly escape the stumbles or even the disasters which so often lie thick around the path of spiritual realization. So this is just the first piece. And then when we see this was the message, then he speaks about perfection of the body, which means two things. First is, even presently, there are many things which are asleep within the body which we have not awakened. I was so happily surprised. I remember not knowing about all this in medical school, very first MBBS. When I read something to the effect, your heart can have an output of, 9 times. Your kidneys can function, even one kidney is enough. Even 1% of the nephrons, if they are alive, they can do the function. If one lung has collapsed, you still can function. You see, Kumar Gandharv even gave a new raga with one lung. So I used to wonder, my God, this is news. So I was so overtaken with it that only some areas of the brain are functioning. There are many which are still asleep. And we have to awaken them. So even within our normal human limits, there is so much the body can do. All that it needs is training. I mean, commandos, some of my army friends, 3 days, just a crash commando training. I'm not talking of those Uri type commandos who are really trained very well. But just any infantry soldier has to also undergo commando training. And 3 days, 3 nights, they have to keep awake. They have to walk with 10 kilo plus of pittu on the back, limited amount of water. They have to manage the food, sometimes hold a snake, cut it and eat it. Carry a matchbox, compass. And they were saying at the end of, one of them was describing at the end of 3rd day, some of them were so tired. They are walking in a group. He said something very funny happened in the beginning. There was a ditch. One fellow fell and said, Gadda hai, dusra bhi gir gaya, tisra. They kept falling. They said, okay, we'll at least know Gadda hai, it's okay. They are informing, but still they are falling. Because you're so dead tired, day and night, you have to stay awake all this. But the body can do it. In extreme situations, how does it happen? How does it function? Normally we can't even imagine. So there are hidden capacities in the body. So there are 2 kinds of perfection of the body. One within the limits of our humanity. In that limit, if you add the mind in its true way, the vital force, you can almost carry it to what extent? If the mind and the intelligence is luminous, upturned, if the heart is full of faith, what is it that the body cannot do? And then to this, when you add the divine possibilities, the divine perfection, then there are no limits. And then he speaks about the divine body. And the divine body, Sri Aurobindo reminds us, because people used to ask, oh, the divine body, you mean like the Chinmay Dehe of, Vaishnavas, and there is a story of, Ramalingam suddenly, disappearing in the grace light, There is word about the luminous etheric body. And Sri Aurobindo will say, remind us, no, it is not about that. Is it about Swami Brahmanand in Narmada who could live for 200 years? No, it is not about that. Why? He said these are individual phenomena where you superimpose the law of a higher consciousness upon the body, as in the case of Swami Brahmanand. So he was not engaging with the outer world actively. So you can enter that state. I see it in Desiree. Forget about where some patients enter into a strange vegetative state. Semi-vegetative. Once in a while you see it. Not vegetative, but semi. So they are fed, they're this thing. Life can prolong for years. It's amazing. Because in extreme dementia, the body, because we take care. If they were left to, no care, then they would probably just pass away. Because we want to take care. Because we don't know till the last moment some realization and what's happening in their inner being, we don't know. But the body itself enters into a state where even with minimum, how it continues and prolongs life. I have seen even people with all kinds of problems, and yet. So these are things about the body we don't know, the secret body consciousness. And yet he says it is not about individual imposing a higher law. It is not about an etheric body where we can live. After departing from here, we can be a demigod like Sage Narada. Sage Narada is in a celestial body. He was a human being on earth. Or like the Ribhus, who were human rishis, who became gods. So now they are in their etheric bodies. So what do? They are artisans of immortality. So they will come on earth. Maybe they can even materialize as a human body, but for a short time. All these are possibilities known. The mother materialized once one who is called as Satan because she wanted to convert him and materialize him. He is a fallen angel. So one of them, so she materialized, brought him as close to the physical as possible. And 6 months he could move around in that state. And the mother was pursuing him, following him. And she asked him, what are you going to do now? I am going to create revolution. And he went to a place where he created revolution which was necessary for the changeover. So all these experiments they were doing in the divine laboratory. And as I have earlier spoken about Eshadi's life and my own ones, they could materialize actual physical human beings. And Sri Aurobindo visualized. So what they were trying, not in an ethereal state, not even an individual superimposing the law of a higher consciousness on the human body to keep it like a pedestal so that they can act. Some yogis do it. They keep the body prolonged so that they can continue to act in this subtle body. Not that. But to change the natural law of evolution of the body. So that the collectivity, see the difference is like in a circus. You teach a monkey to ride a cycle. No, a dog, no? Dogs riding cycle. Parrot riding a cycle, I've seen that. You can teach a parrot riding cycle. But do parrots ride cycle? The parrot is a parrot. You can teach and train a dog to do mathematics. So how will a dog do mathematics? You will say 2 and he will go pick up 2 and put it. I have seen this. Then you say plus, he'll pick up plus and put it on the board. 4, he'll pick up 4 and put it. Equal to, now he has to calculate. Now he has been trained so well that there are a number of numbers, but he'll pick up 6 and put 6. I hope I am right, huh? 2 plus 4 equal to 6. So he'll pick up 6 and put it there. Does it mean that the dog brains have evolved to do mathematics? No. So this is the difference. He wants it as a natural dharma, like we read in Satyug, people lived for 1,000 years. In Dwapar, just close to us, 120 years was a normal thing. Going beyond 100, you were youth. So that must change. So this is a different thing. It means the human body must itself evolve from within it the ability to prolong life, the ability to rejuvenate itself, become youthful, the ability to eventually find the secret of immortality. So, this is what is the divine body which he is speaking about, a body which will evolve and through evolution become increasingly divine, just as the ape body has become a mentalized human body. Then, of course, there are a series of essays on supermind and the life divine, how it will act, and how supermind will act upon humanity. Now, in humanity, he makes it very clear not all human beings are going to wake up, because if you're looking in the masses, forget about finding the right thing. Where is the supermind working? Maybe in a child, carelessly smiling, or maybe an adolescent whom you say, Beta kya karega? Or in a little child whom you call and say, Oh, suna na nursery rhyme? Child says, what? Walks away from you because he knows this is, what is this? You are treating me like a child? I am an ageless soul. Respect at least my honor my. Or you tell a child, just touch the feet, na? Uncle has come. No way. Or you tell a child, who is a bit adolescent, so what are you going to do? Well, Dad, I am going to figure it out. Where does this come from? This sense of spontaneous trust in life. These children know. Parents are worried. And there are two kinds of parents and children. One, career, ambition, they are busy with all that rat race. And there is a set of children who are slowly getting separated from this category. You ask them, what are you going to do? Typical children, knowledge, we'll see. So after they complete knowledge, have you seen? I am thinking sometime they take a break, go around. This is a new age humanity. So this is the impact of the supermind, that there will be a group of humanity which will slowly get into the redundant. It will be dated. Why? Because it has refused the evolutionary urge. It will happen to many religions also, because they have become rigid, entrenched in their dogmas. But another kind of humanity which may not use the word spiritual, religious and all that, and yet it is evolving towards Godhead because it has a thirst for progress and perfection. It believes in the destiny of earth. It's not nirashavadi that ultimately in my retirement I will sing some bhajans and I will seek moksha in some ashramas. No. So that is the kind of humanity which is going to evolve. And the mother describes this beautifully in notes on the way, where she says she saw Sri Aurobindo was present all the time during one of her darshans, he describes. And he was showing her the three types of humanity. She says there is one kind of humanity which is very satisfied with itself. Leave them. Don't touch them. They are not ready. They just want to further their ambition. Let them be where they are. Don't try to tell them about supermind, new creation. They will not understand. They will get confused and try to confuse you. Of course, if you have the clarity, that's different. But there is no point, because you don't go to an ape and tell him to take music lessons. Understand the dignity of what is being taught, given. Then there is second layer of humanity which believes a higher future but is not ready to pay the price. It's not ready to undergo the suffering and self-discipline which is required. So it will evolve into a higher humanity, which will eventually evolve toward the supramental creation. And there is a rare few people who not only are aware, who read, but they are ready to pay the price needed for the evolution next. They will evolve into the new race, the new creation of the future. And yes, a large chunk of humanity which refuses obstinately, is happy with its perversity, is creating nothing but chaos upon earth, that will collapse and be absorbed back, because it has not outlived by its purpose. It was an abortive attempt. Out of the animal, it tried to give birth to humanity, but there was a group which remained perverted, which just couldn't take up. It used the mind and the animal consciousness. Look at it, what is the dangerous combination? You have an intelligent mind and you have completely animal consciousness. So they mastered the art of deception, perversity, and this humanities. There is no higher thirst, there is no aspiration, no longing for anything greater. So this is destined to collapse. So supermind and humanity, Sri Aurobindo explains all this in different way. Supermind in the evolution, where he says that supermind is there already involved. It is the inevitable destiny of earth. You can't stop it. So what has Sri Aurobindo done? Compress the time. What would have taken million years through lot of suffering and who knows what kind of passages, maybe another pralaya, he has compressed it into 1,000 years. And then there's a very beautiful essay or two. One is Mind of Light and the other is Supermind and Mind of Light. So what is the mind of light? Normally our mind is a mind of ignorance. That means it is ignorant seeking for light. Mind of light in which fundamental ignorance is gone. Now it is moving from light to greater light. So mind of light is the junction between mind at its apex and the first supramental touch. So it is the apex that mind can reach. It is the starting point of the supramental realization upon earth. So that is the mind of light. Mother explains it very beautifully. So mind of light is the first necessity, because it's only when mind is fundamentally freed from ignorance that it can start, because mind is the leader. Man, pran, sharir, neta. Even when the psychic being comes out, mind must collaborate. If the mind keeps throwing doubts, it won't work out. So, and the mind has to also learn to master the physical movement, the autonomous system. So, all that he describes here. And so, I'll just read maybe just one or two passages. How beautifully Sri Aurobindo has, for instance, a divine life in a divine body is the formula of the ideal that we envisage. Not just divine life, but divine life in a divine body. In fact, divine life cannot be lived fully unless the body has become divine. Because the animal consciousness will keep on creating struggle and problems. But what will be the divine body? What will be the nature of this body, its structure, the principle of its activity? Will it work according to the chakra systems? What will happen to the organs? How will they reproduce? Sri Aurobindo even goes on to discuss that. And there he says that in ancient times there was a way. He said science will find a way that without going through the sexual process you can reproduce. Cloning was nowhere in sight. So why? Because what's wrong with the sexual process of reproduction? Because there is a great loss and waste. But there is a possibility of, and this is going to improve. Maybe we'll find more direct ways. And then he speaks of occult intervention of yogis who blessed and a child was born to a lady. Now these occult interventions, so all these will come in the realm of possibility. And then he speaks about the destiny of the body. Two problems. He said the difficulty is dual. Physical, corporeal and psychological. So corporeally he has talked about the body, and then psychological. He said there are two main problems that will come up in this process of transformation. One is the sexual impulse and the other is food. Now see how Sri Aurobindo is dealing with it in 1949, 1950. So he speaks about the sexual impulse. See, nothing he has left untouched. The first of these two difficulties, or rather let me read. It is the effect of the unregenerated animality upon the life, especially by the insistence of the body's gross instincts, impulses, desires, which is sexuality. The second is the outcome of our corporeal structure and organic instrumentation, imposing its restrictions on the dynamism of the higher divine nature, which is food. And they had experimented on all this, and because paucity of time and we are focused on the book, so we are not talking about it. But just to read this passage, the first of these two difficulties is easier to deal with and conquer. For here the will can intervene and impose on the body the power of the higher nature. Certain of these impulses and instincts of the body have been found especially harmful by the spiritual aspirant and weighed considerably in favor of an ascetic rejection of the body. Why? Because they just couldn't get over the sexuality. See, if you read about the famous book Brahmacharya, which is written by Swami Sivananda, great yogi, at the end, he says only grace can get you rid of it. Not only that, they devised methods. He recommends a method. He says, when you look at a woman, think that she is just muscles and bones and all meat and all the dirt inside. He says, if you keep meditating on it, you will eventually get rid. When somebody asked Sri Aurobindo about it, Sri Aurobindo says, this is not our path, Just imagine. And why only? Then of course he says the same women can apply with regard to men. But that's not the way, because you will throw the baby with the bath water. Sri Aurobindo wants to keep the baby and throw the bath water. Now look how he's saying. Precise surgery. Sex and sexuality and all that springs from sex and testifies to its existence had to be banned and discarded from the spiritual life, and this, though difficult, is not at all impossible and can be made a cardinal condition for the spiritual seeker. This is natural and unescapable in all ascetic practice. And the satisfaction of this condition, though not easy at first to fulfill, becomes after a time quite feasible. So it's not like, let's start with the most difficult thing. The overcoming of the sex instinct and impulse is indeed binding on all who would attain to self-mastery and lead the spiritual life. A total mastery over it is essential for all spiritual seekers. The eradication of it for the complete ascetic. Now mark the slight changes in the tone. And then he says, this much has to be recognized and not diminished in its obligatory importance and its principle. But all recognition of the sex principle as apart from the gross physical indulgence of the sex impulse could not be excluded from a divine life upon earth. It is there in life, plays a large part, and has to be dealt with. It cannot simply be ignored. Realist, spiritual realist, merely suppressed or held down or put away out of sight. In the first place, it is in one of its aspects, a cosmic and even a divine principle. It takes the spiritual form of the Ishvara and the Shakti, and without it there could be no world creation or manifestation of the world principle of the Purusha and Prakriti, which are both necessary for the creation. When Mother was asked the simple question, what is the spiritual reason behind attraction of a man and a woman? She said, Purusha and Prakriti. That's all she said. That is the two modes of functioning of the one. Necessary too in their association in interchange for the play of its psychological working, and in their manifestation as soul and nature fundamental to the whole process of the Leela. So one may say that in every man there is a woman, yes, but it's a woman who brings out the woman inside a man, to put it that way. In every woman there is a man, yes, but it's very often the association of the man which brings out that strength, that masculine element of thought, ideative mentality within her. So we have to look at it like this. In the divine life itself, an incarnation, or at least in some form a presence of the two powers, or their initiating influence through their embodiments or representatives, would be indispensable for making the new creation possible. In its human action on the mental and vital level, sex is not altogether an undivine principle. It has its nobler aspects and idealities, and it is to be seen in what way and to what extent these can be admitted into the new and larger life. And then he says something very interesting. What has to be definitely removed is all gross animal indulgence of sex desire impulse would have to be eliminated. The gross aspect. It could only continue among those who are not ready for the higher life or not yet ready for a complete spiritual living. So many conditions he has given. In all who aspired to it but could not yet take it up in its fullness, sex will have to be refined, submit to the spiritual or psychic impulse and a control by the higher mind and the higher vital, and shed it all its lighter, frivolous or degraded forms, and feel the touch of the purity of the ideal. Love would remain. All forms of the pure truth of love in higher and higher steps, till it realized its highest nature, widened into universal love, merged into the love of the divine. Now you see, with what clarity these writings are, and so contemporary. The love of man and woman would also undergo that elevation and consummation. Nowhere he is saying that, you have to discard it, but sublimate, transform it. These are his writings, 1950, testimonials. The love of man and woman would also undergo that elevation and consummation, for all that can feel a touch of the ideal and the spiritual must follow the way of ascent till it reaches the divine reality. The body and its activities must be accepted as part of the divine life and pass under this law. But, as in the other evolutionary transition, what cannot accept the law of the divine life cannot be accepted and must fall away from the ascending nature. This is what is happening. When Mother was asked, how will the crude sexual impulse be eliminated from nature? She laughed and said, nature has her ways. And then she said, impotence is taking over man. This is a fact. If you really go into the data, nature has her ways. This is one of the ways of removing the degrading aspects, but keeping the beautiful aspects. So all this he brings out. Let me just read the last bit. I've taken out several pages. Maybe we can post it if possible. He defines mind of light. The people have written books on it and several complicated things. Mind of light. Sri Aurobindo describes so beautifully. It is the mind of light. It is in this series of the order of existence and as the last word of the lower hemisphere of being. Physical, vital, mind, 3 steps of the mind, further 3 steps of the mind, and last order, the highest ascent that is possible in the lower hemisphere. The first word of the higher hemisphere. So it is the meeting point of the supramental and the human mind, which is transmuted by the rays. The first word of the higher hemisphere that we have to look, higher hemisphere is supermind and beyond, lower hemisphere is mind, life, body. That we have to look at the mind of light and see what is its nature and the powers which characterize it and which it uses for its self-manifestation and workings, its connection with supermind and its consequences and possibilities for the life of a new humanity. He describes all this about the new race in great detail. How the mind of light will, the moment one has it, will dispense away that laborious process of rational mind. Spontaneously, the faculties of the rishis, higher inspiration, intuition, revelation, they will start operating very naturally because it's an illumined mind. It's not a mind which is groping in ignorance. So that's how, just this last sentence I'll read. A new humanity means for us the appearance, the development of a type or race of mental beings whose principle of mentality would be no longer a mind in the ignorance, seeking for knowledge, but even in its knowledge bound to the ignorance, which is what we see, the normal mind, scientific mind, much of these minds are like that. But even in its knowledge bound to the ignorance, which is the normal mind, a seeker after light, but not its natural possessor. The normal mind, it reads books, tries to understand, but it's not in possession of that light. Not yet a perfected instrument, not an inhabitant of the light, open to the light, but not an inhabitant. Not yet a perfected instrument, truth conscious and delivered out of the ignorance. Instead, what will the mind of light do? So this is the new race, the first he speaks of, the first born of a supernal race. Once this is done, the rest will follow. The new race, he is characterizing it, still having a human body and which is touched by human animality. Still the mind is operating, but what kind of mind? Instead, it would be possessed already of what could be called a mind of light. A mind capable of living in the truth, capable of being truth conscious and manifesting in its life a direct in place of an indirect knowledge. It won't need to go through the process of analysis, rational thinking, ifs and buts. It will be able to see it directly. Whether rest of the members can immediately follow it or not, but it will be like a really guide, just as Superman consciousness is a mentor. So the mind of light is a guide. It is already there. It will not, or it will reveal to us. Its mentality would be an instrument of the light and no longer of the ignorance. At its highest, it would be capable of passing into the supermind, and from the new race would be recruited the race of supramental beings who would appear as the leaders of the evolution in earth nature. So he speaks about the new race with the mind of light, but a human body. So all the challenges of the human body. And out of this mind of light evolving to its acme, where it begins to melt into the supramental, there will be the supramental beings and the supramental race. Even the highest manifestations of a mind of light would be an instrumentality of the supermind, a part of it or a projection from it, a stepping beyond humanity into the superhumanity of the supramental principle. Above all, its possession would enable the human being to rise beyond the normalities of his present thinking. Look at the word. Sri Aurobindo has not used the word limits, normality of his present thinking. What we call as the norm would break, because this mind will perceive, think, understand very differently. Normalities of the present thinking, beyond the normalities of his present thinking, feeling and being into those highest powers of the mind in its self-exceedings which intervene between our mentality and supermind, which are the ones which are inspiration, intuition, revelation, and illumination, and can be regarded as steps leading toward the greater and more luminous principle. All this wonderfully explained in great detail. Those who want to know what really will be the supramental manifestation, of course, combine it with Mother's writings to get the full picture, because Mother wrote after the supramental manifestation took place. Because she started working and she saw how the organs are responding, how the new body is being formed. So that's a different story. But here, Sri Aurobindo has already laid all the necessary steps, issues, problems. He has foreseen the difficulties. Even switching over to a new body, which I have spoken of in different times. All this, what the new race will be. So clearly, he explains. And what is the difference between the new race and the race of supramental beings? So with this, we'll close about essays in philosophy and yoga. Thank you.